Welcome to WineGrind. I'm Ed Doakland. I'm here with Fred Frank, the winemaker and owner of Dr. Konstantin Frank, with the beautiful Finger Lakes in the background. And how do you say this lake again?
Keuka.
Keuka Lake. So you started in 1962 here?
Yes. Well, Ed, thanks for joining us here. Picked a beautiful August day to tour the vineyards and the cellars and taste some world-class wines. The winery was started by my grandfather, Dr. Konstantin Frank, and he was not a medical doctor, but rather a PhD in viticulture, which is the science of grape growing. And he's credited with first introducing the noble Vitis vinifera, or European wine grapes, to the eastern United States. Now, this had been tried for hundreds of years. In fact, Thomas Jefferson had tried at his estate in Virginia and had gotten cuttings from his friends in Bordeaux, France. And within a few years, the vines died. And one of the reasons for hundreds of years of failure in trying to grow the European vines in the eastern United States is that we had a pest in the soils here called phylloxera. This is a little root louse, and this would eat the roots of the European vines. So Dr. Frank was among the European scientists that perfected the grafting technique, whereby they took cuttings from the Vitis labrusca, or the native American varieties, and they grafted them onto the European vine, and thus they were able to grow the European vines in the soils here with the phylloxera, and able to coexist with the phylloxera without them damaging the vine. So it's sort of, they were ahead of their time. Today in modern agriculture we'd call this biological control, where you're coexisting with a pest rather than trying to kill it with dangerous pesticides.
And that was basically because the vinifera grapes wouldn't be able to survive the winters here. So
that was another benefit. Yes, the rootstocks helped them better survive the winter, sort of shortened their growing season and made them more winter hardy. But the main benefit of the rootstocks was to protect them from the phylloxera. And unfortunately, in California, they didn't use the proper rootstocks on the majority of vineyards. And so over the last 10 or 15 years, most of the old vine vineyards in California had to be replanted with the proper rootstock vines. In our case, since we used the proper rootstock from the beginning, which is back in the 1950s, we now have some of the oldest vineyards, depending on the variety, in the entire United States.
So you were saying that you had a Pinot Noir vineyard up here.
That's correct. It's over 50 years old, and in a book called North American Pinot Noir, the author researched it as the second oldest Pinot Noir vineyard in the entire United States. So on our Pinot Noir label, which is currently 2008 vintage, it actually says old vines.
So now all these lakes were formed by the glacier receding here.
Right.
So you have a myriad of different soils here.
We do. So in the Finger Lakes region, as you said, the glaciers deposited different soils as they receded. And this gives us a lot of soil diversity within our wine growing region. And it adds to the complexity of the wines. And it's particularly useful with a variety like Riesling, which is very expressive of the soil where it's grown. So in other words, the flavors of the Riesling wine change depending on the soil type where it's grown. And what we found in the growing Riesling over 50 years in the Finger Lakes is that we now source specific vineyard sites for the style of Riesling. Riesling is very diverse also in the styles of wine. And so, for example, right behind us are our Keuka Lake vineyards that have very rocky, stony soils, quite a bit of shale in the soils. And these rocky soils, we believe, produce a mineral style in the Riesling wine. Some writers call it minerality. And this works very nicely in our dry style Riesling, which is one of our most famous wines. Riesling remains our #1 variety. And the style of Riesling changes depending on the soil type. And then we produce a semi-dry Riesling, which comes primarily from our Seneca Lake vineyards, where we have a deeper loamy soil, and the semi-dry is more of a fruit-forward. You get nice apricot and peach flavors in this wine, and it finishes off with about 2.7 residual sugar as compared to the dry, which is 0.6. So they're quite different in their styles.
So Seneca Lake is like a couple of lakes over, right?
It's actually the next lake over, and it's
and
a
so you
bigger,
have vineyards
deeper.
over
We
there.
have vineyards there, and it's a bigger, deeper lake, and it has deeper soils also. So it produces a different flavor profile in the Riesling.
So the soils all around this lake are all sort of rocky minerally, or does it change as you go up the hill?
They're primarily the Keuka. We own vineyards on the western side, and they are quite rocky and quite steep sloped. So they're poor soils basically, and they produce smaller vine. They're better draining soils because they're steep slopes. So it's not only is it a different soil, but it's a different terroir.
So tasting through the wines, one thing that impressed me, especially in the whites, is that there's this nice vein of minerality, but yet you're able to attain such really nice acidity in these wines.
That's
and
correct.
Is that because of the cool climate, or is it just...
Definitely, the cool climate is a key to having natural high acidities, along with lower pHs naturally in the wines, and typically that's an ideal aging formula. So we have wines going back to 1962 in our wine library cellar, and occasionally we'll open these wines up, and we're always impressed at how well they age.
So when you started this operation in 1962, how many wineries were in the area? Well, this region sort of has
about
history.
a dozen, yeah. So it was a much smaller industry. It was dominated by several large producers making primarily Labrusca wines, that is from the native grapes like Concord, Catawba, and those style of wines were very fruity. Some experts call them foxy, and they were sweet. And that was sort of the general style that was popular back in the 50s and the 60s. Wines like Cold Duck, Pink Catawba, Cream White Concord. You know, there was a big market for that style of wine. And gradually the consumer taste became more refined, and consumers were demanding the higher quality wines from the Vitis vinifera grapes, or the European grapes. So the Californians, Robert Mondavi was one of the first to introduce premium varietal wines in California back in the mid to late 60s, and that really sparked this move towards quality in California wines. It really hurt the New York vintners in that they weren't able to change with changing consumer tastes. On the other hand, Dr. Frank, with his wines, they were the premium varietal vinifera wines, so he actually was sort of ahead of his time from a marketing standpoint. You know, back in the early 60s, he was the only winery on the East Coast doing vinifera wines, and then it took several decades for a few pioneering wineries to follow his lead, and he was very generous with his advice, and he sold grafted vines to other eastern wineries. And today, it's just been a renaissance. I mean, in New York alone, we have over 300 wineries, and all 50 states in the United States have wineries. So it's really a remarkable transformation. And I think this expansion of wineries in the U.S. has also contributed to increased wine enjoyment, because it's given more Americans an opportunity to visit wineries, to visit the local vineyards, and basically learn more about wines, and it brings it more down to earth.
So how many wineries are in the Finger Lakes now, the area?
Currently about 200 within the Finger Lakes region. And every year we get a few new wineries. Our winery is considered historic by Eastern standards. We were founded as in 1962. Our first vines were planted in the late 1950s, and we're now in our third generation of family operations. And my daughter Megan hopes to continue the winery into its fourth generation. So we're very excited. By Eastern standards, we're a very historic, pioneering winery. You know, we're excited about the renaissance that's occurred in the Finger Lakes. We're getting more and more awards, and more consumers are recognizing what a beautiful wine region this is. Just a short drive from many cities in the Northeast. You know, rather than saving up all year to fly to Napa and sitting in a traffic jam, you can come to the Finger Lakes and feel what California was like perhaps 30 years ago.
Mm-hmm.